In the sultry summer of 2013, Jackson, Mississippi simmered with tradition and faith, woven tightly together in the heart of the Bee Haven neighborhood. At its spiritual and social center stood Pastor Samuel Bennett, a man whose presence in the community had become synonymous with unwavering morality and spiritual strength. At 46, Pastor Bennett wasn't just a preacher, he was a force. His sermons could reach deep into the hearts of the most disillusioned souls, stirring emotions and inspiring change. Mount Zion Baptist, the church he led, was more than a house of worship. It was the bedrock of the community. Every Sunday, it drew hundreds of faithful followers seeking more than just Scripture. Pastor Bennett's life seemed like the very image of contentment. He lived in a grand house just blocks away from the church with his wife, Grace, a woman of quiet resolve and unshakable faith. Together, they had raised 2 teenagers, both shining examples of their family's values. To his congregation, Samuel was the gold standard, disciplined, compassionate, unassailable. But behind the thick doors of his study, Pastor Bennett wrestled with silent torment. The burden of leadership, the constant weight of expectation, and the slow suffocation of a life lived under scrutiny had begun to corrode his spirit. And then came Jordan Mitchell. Jordan Mitchell was 23, vibrant, confident, and strikingly charismatic. A recent transplant to Jackson for college, he caught the eye of many at Mount Zion Baptist the moment he walked through its doors. But it was Pastor Bennett who found himself particularly drawn to the young man. At first, their connection was innocent. Jordan was curious, eager to learn, often staying after sermons to ask thoughtful questions or share personal doubts. But soon, those conversations deepened. They grew longer, more intimate. Samuel, who had always held his feelings tightly under control, began to look forward to Jordan's visits with a yearning that unsettled him. There was something in the way Jordan listened, with open curiosity, quiet admiration, that unraveled the carefully stitched seams of the pastor's composure. Jordan, too, felt something, a magnetic pull toward the man who embodied wisdom and authority, yet carried an undercurrent of sadness he couldn't ignore. Late-night meetings in the quiet shadows of the church turned into soul-bearing conversations. Their bond shifted from mentorship to something more fragile, more forbidden. A touch lingered longer than it should have. A glance carried unspoken weight. And slowly, irresistibly, the line between guidance and desire blurred. Both men teetered on the edge of something dangerous, pulled in by an emotional gravity neither could explain nor escape. Pastor Bennett was no fool. He understood the peril of what was unfolding, knew that every lingering look and private meeting was a step closer to disaster. Yet, the magnetic pull between him and Jordan eclipsed his better judgment. It wasn't just about attraction, it was about escape. In Jordan, he glimpsed a world outside the suffocating walls of duty and expectation. A world where passion still lived. By the end of that summer, what had begun as a simple mentorship had erupted into a secret affair, emotional, physical, and impossibly risky. They met in shadows, behind locked doors, always aware that a single misstep could shatter everything. For Samuel, each encounter felt like walking a tightrope between salvation and ruin. For Jordan, it was a heady, intoxicating mix of power and intimacy. In every whispered confession, every stolen moment, their connection deepened, and so did the danger. They convinced themselves they could control it, that as long as they stayed careful, no one would ever know. But the truth has a way of surfacing, and even as they clung to their secret, the first cracks were already forming, silent fractures that would soon split their world apart. As autumn painted Jackson in amber and rust, the relationship between Pastor Bennett and Jordan Mitchell evolved into something far more volatile. What had once been thrilling became a carefully orchestrated performance of secrecy. Their meetings were scheduled with military precision, always late at night, always in places where familiar eyes wouldn't follow. One favorite hideaway was a quiet, dimly lit park on the outskirts of town. There, in the privacy of a parked car beneath whispering trees, stolen touches and hushed words gave them fleeting moments of freedom, but even as their passion smoldered, the weight of deceit grew heavier. By day, Samuel stood behind the pulpit, condemning sin with fiery conviction. By night, he succumbed to the very temptations he preached against. The contradiction gnawed at him, but the electric pull he felt in Jordan's presence dulled the guilt, at least for a while. This was more than physical. Samuel found in Jordan a kindred spirit, someone who saw beyond the robe and collar, someone who understood his fears, his fatigue, his ache for something real. And Jordan, caught in the orbit of a man so revered, felt empowered. He tasted influence, importance, and he wanted more. Yet beneath that craving stirred something darker, resentment. Jordan began to question the nature of their connection. Was it love, or simply a means for the pastor to indulge a hidden desire without consequence? Still, neither man could walk away. Not yet. With winter's approach, the tension between them thickened like the cold Mississippi air. Every meeting became more perilous, every excuse harder to maintain. Samuel's double life was fraying at the edges. The fear of discovery wrapped around him like a noose, each Sunday sermon feeling more like a performance, each glance from his wife more like an accusation. And yet, the idea of losing Jordan was unbearable. Their affair had become a lifeline and an addiction. Samuel clung to it in desperation, even as it pulled him deeper into moral ruin. Jordan, on the other hand, was growing weary. The secrecy that once thrilled him now suffocated him. He no longer felt like an equal, only a shadow in someone else's life. A secret to be hidden rather than a person to be cherished. Resentment festered. The imbalance between them widened. Jordan felt used. Samuel felt trapped. And still, the dance continued, frantic, reckless, doomed. The walls around them were closing in. Samuel's sermons lost their fire, his smile its warmth. He was unraveling, and though no one in the congregation could name it, they sensed it. Something had shifted. The man they had once revered was slipping, and the truth behind his eyes was darker than they could imagine. As the year waned, the storm beneath the surface threatened to explode. Samuel could barely keep up the facade. He had grown gaunt, haunted, consumed by fear. At home, Grace watched her husband's slow unraveling with quiet alarm. The late nights, the distant gaze, the unexplained absences. Something was wrong, deeply wrong. But she wasn't the only one watching. Deacon Harold Thompson, a pillar of the Greater Faith Baptist Church, received a chilling note, anonymous, typed, brief. Your pastor is not the man you think he is. He's involved in a relationship that will destroy this church. At first, Thompson dismissed it. Surely not Samuel Bennett, not the man who had led their community with strength and humility for decades. But the seed had been planted. A man of careful discipline, Thompson began to investigate. Quietly, methodically. He pulled phone records through a friend at the local exchange. Call after call to Jordan Mitchell, always late at night, well beyond pastoral duty. The pattern was impossible to ignore. Then came surveillance. Thompson followed Samuel one evening, his heart sinking as he watched the pastor embrace Jordan in the shadows of a distant parking lot. It was not the embrace of friends or spiritual guide and mentee. It was intimate enough to shatter faith. Thompson was shaken. He continued to observe, each new piece of evidence chipping away at the image of the man he had once trusted without question. Photographs of clandestine meetings, hotel receipts matching Samuel's unexplained absences, quiet confessions from members of the church who had noticed the uneasy closeness between the pastor and the young man. The truth became undeniable and unbearable. Thompson was caught in a moral crossfire. His loyalty to the church warred with his loyalty to its leader. But the weight of the evidence pressed harder each day, and the walls of secrecy were beginning to echo with whispers that spread. The congregation felt it, the shift, the tension. Pastor Bennett, once a figure of unwavering certainty, seemed fragile, withdrawn. His sermons lacked the fire that once moved hundreds. His relationship with Grace had grown cold. Even his children, once proud and close, had begun to pull away. The church, a sanctuary for so many, now held a dangerous secret, one that pulsed beneath its stained glass windows and creaked in the pews. Samuel's house of worship, and the legacy he had built within it, was starting to crack. The truth, long buried beneath lies and longing, was clawing its way to the surface. By the summer of 2014, the secret that had once burned with passion now threatened to explode. Jordan Mitchell had grown bitter, tired of hiding in the margins of someone else's life. The whispered promises meant to comfort him now rang hollow. He had sacrificed his privacy, his dignity, and for what? A shadowy half-love that left him invisible and silenced. The balance of power shifted. Jordan was no longer content to be a secret. One night, his frustration boiling over, he confronted Pastor Bennett after one of their covert meetings. This time, Jordan wasn't the uncertain student seeking guidance. He was angry, hardened, betrayed. He issued an ultimatum. Either Pastor Bennett would acknowledge their relationship publicly, or Jordan would do it for him. No more hiding, no more games. And if the pastor wasn't willing to come clean, then he'd have to pay. The threat hit Samuel like a lightning bolt. His world, carefully built on image and influence, teetered on the edge of collapse. He pleaded, bargained. But Jordan was resolute. He wanted money, a specific amount, enough to wound but not destroy. Not yet. Cornered, Samuel relented. The first payment came from the church's emergency fund. It was enough to satisfy Jordan, for a moment, but that moment didn't last. With each payment, Jordan's demands grew sharper, more erratic. The thrill of control quickly morphed into hunger, for more money, more power, more acknowledgement. What had once been a secret affair had become a parasitic exchange, feeding off fear and silence. Pastor Bennett's world began to unravel. The church's financials faltered as he siphoned more funds to keep Jordan quiet. The treasurer raised an eyebrow. The deacons whispered, and still, Samuel couldn't stop. Jordan began to appear unannounced, outside the pastor's home, at church events, in public places where a single photograph could end everything. The pressure was relentless. Samuel's once proud posture wilted. His face aged. His sermons became scattered, tinged with a quiet desperation his congregation couldn't place but deeply felt. At home, Grace had stopped asking questions. But she noticed the midnight departures, the drained accounts, the heavy silences between them. Their children, once the joy of Samuel's life, became strangers, reminders of a happiness he could no longer reach. Even the church felt it. The pews that once overflowed with devotion now stood half empty. The warmth in the sanctuary turned cold. Faith had become suspicion, and Pastor Bennett was suffocating in the very life he'd built. By the time autumn arrived in 2014, Samuel Bennett was drowning in dread. The payments had become a chain around his neck, each demand from Jordan pulling him closer to collapse. The fear of exposure loomed larger with every passing day, eclipsing even the guilt that gnawed at him from within. Then came the storm. On the night of October 15th, a tempest swept through Jackson. Thunder crashing, rain lashing the streets, wind howling like a warning. But it was nothing compared to the storm raging inside Pastor Bennett. He had reached the edge, and in that fragile, fractured state, he made a decision that would forever alter the course of his life. He would end it, not the affair, not the payments, but Jordan. The meeting was arranged under the guise of a final payout, a clean break, a final chapter. The place, a remote stretch of road swallowed by trees and cloaked in rain. Jordan arrived unaware, expecting money. What he found was something far more sinister. Samuel waited by his car, soaked and shaking. The tension between them was electric, volatile. Words were exchanged, clipped, angry, final. Jordan demanded what he was owed, and Samuel reached into his coat pocket. In that moment, something inside Samuel shattered. Fear, shame, rage. Every emotion he had buried came roaring to the surface. His hand emerged clutching a heavy metal object, hidden until now, concealed like the truth he'd spent a year denying. In a blind, desperate panic, Pastor Bennett struck. The blow landed with brutal force. Jordan staggered, shocked, the pain too sudden to process. Another strike, then silence. He crumpled to the ground, lifeless, the rain quickly turning the earth beneath him into a shallow pool of blood and mud. For a moment, time stood still. The storm roared, indifferent. Samuel stood frozen, staring down at what he had done, at the young man he had once desired, once confided in, once loved, now gone. The horror of it gripped him, but instinct took over. He dragged Jordan's body into the woods, heart pounding with each labored step through the wet, clinging dirt. Beneath the twisted roots of an oak tree, he dug. A shallow grave, temporary, hastily carved by hands trembling with guilt. He buried the body, buried the phone. After wiping it clean and smashing it, buried the evidence, buried the truth. But guilt does not stay buried. Samuel returned home under the cover of darkness, drenched in rain and dread. On the surface, nothing had changed. The house was quiet. Grace was asleep. The world still turned. But inside, everything had ruptured. The man who once commanded the pulpit with fire and grace was now a ghost of himself. His eyes lost their light. His voice, once rich with conviction, trembled with an emptiness no scripture could conceal. The guilt consumed him, a slow, relentless fire that burned behind every word, every breath. People noticed. His congregation, once hanging on his every sermon, now sat in uneasy silence. They felt the shift. The sermons were hollow. The warmth was gone. The man they had trusted had become something else, something distant, haunted. At home, the cracks deepened. Grace watched him unravel, piecing together the signs with quiet devastation. His absences, the late-night stares into nothing, the withdrawn bank accounts. She didn't ask. She already knew. Not the details, but enough. His children avoided him now, sensing the shadow he cast. The man who once guided their lives with calm assurance had become someone unrecognizable. And all the while, beneath the surface of Jackson, questions were beginning to stir. Whispers of a disappearance, of a young man no one had seen in days. Jordan Mitchell was missing. Jordan's absence did not go unnoticed for long. His mother, alarmed by his sudden silence, reported him missing within days. Jordan had always stayed in touch, with a call, a message, a simple check-in. But now, nothing. The Jackson police launched a search, assigning the case to Detective Lisa Morgan, a seasoned investigator known for her patience and precision. She started with Jordan's circle, unraveling his recent habits, contacts, and relationships. It wasn't long before a familiar name surfaced, Pastor Samuel Bennett. At first, the connection seemed incidental. Just a young man who had attended church, perhaps found guidance in the older man. But phone records told a different story. Dozens of messages, late-night calls, a tone that hinted at intimacy, not mentorship. The pattern was undeniable. Detective Morgan pushed deeper. She spoke with church members, piecing together fragments of concern, hushed conversations, glances that lingered, stories that didn't quite add up. Then came Deacon Thompson, reluctantly, solemnly, offering what he had uncovered in secret. Surveillance photos, phone logs, hearsay, yes, but compelling. And then the break came. A trail of bank transfers, money, substantial and regular, flowing from Pastor Bennett's personal account to one in Jordan's name. The motive began to take shape. By November 2014, the case had shifted from a missing person to something far more sinister. The mounting evidence, digital traces, whispered testimonies, financial trails, all pointed in one direction. Pastor Samuel Bennett wasn't just involved, he was central. Still, Detective Morgan needed more. She dug deeper, pulling metadata from devices, revisiting witnesses, following the money, and then came the second phone. A hidden line Jordan had used for private communication with the pastor. Its messages were raw, desperate, explicit. They chronicled not only the relationship, but the blackmail, the threats, the unraveling. With this, Morgan obtained a warrant. She and her team searched Samuel's home and church office with clinical thoroughness, and there, in a locked drawer, they found what no sermon could explain. A journal. A scattered record of guilt, anxiety, veiled confessions. It spoke of a burden too great to bear, of fear, of finality. On December 2nd, Pastor Bennett was arrested. The community was stunned. The courthouse was flooded with press, parishioners, and skeptics. The man who had been their spiritual anchor now stood accused of murder. Faces once turned to him in reverence now stared in disbelief. And Samuel, pale, drawn, silent, finally faced the reckoning he had long feared. The trial of Pastor Samuel Bennett began on February 16, 2015, in the Hinds County Courthouse, a solemn structure now swarmed by cameras, reporters, and a community hungry for answers. Inside, the air was thick with tension. Every seat was filled. Faces from his congregation sat shoulder to shoulder with strangers, all waiting to witness the fall of a man once cloaked in righteousness. District Attorney Karen Jackson led the prosecution. Calm, relentless, she laid out the story like a blade, precise and devastating. The affair, the blackmail, the mounting fear, the murder. She called it a tragedy born from cowardice and concealment. Her case was airtight. Text messages, bank records, the confessional journal. Witness after witness took the stand. Jordan's family, heartbroken. Church members betrayed. Detective Morgan, methodical and clear. They painted a picture not of a one-time slip, but of a man who had lived a lie for over a year and killed to keep it buried. The defense, led by Richard Malone, grasped for empathy. He called Samuel a man of God, pushed to the brink, claiming self-defense, painting Jordan as unstable. But the evidence, and the silence from Samuel himself, crushed any doubt. Throughout the trial, Pastor Bennett barely looked up. Grace, ever present behind him, sat motionless, her pain visible in every line of her face. The trial lasted 3 weeks. 3 weeks of unraveling a life built on appearances. On March 10, 2015, the jury filed back into the courtroom, the weight of their decision evident in their solemn expressions. It took only 5 hours. Guilty. First-degree murder. A collective gasp filled the courtroom, followed by silence. Samuel Bennett stood still, expressionless, as if the words hadn't quite reached him. But behind him, Grace finally broke, her quiet strength giving way to raw, uncontrollable sobs. The sound echoed off the walls, like a final note in a hymn long gone silent. The judge delivered the sentence with calm finality. Life in prison, without the possibility of parole. A fitting end, some whispered. A tragedy, said others. But all agreed. Something sacred had been broken. The aftermath rippled through Jackson. Mount Zion Baptist Church, once a cornerstone of hope, stood fractured. Congregants left in waves, unable to reconcile the man they once worshipped with the truths now exposed. Faith, in the church, in its leaders, even in God, was shaken. Samuel Bennett's story became legend. A cautionary tale of power hidden behind a pulpit, of secrets too dark to keep, of desire that devoured everything in its path. And though the trial ended, its shadow lingered, not just over a congregation, but over an entire city that would never see its pastor the same way again.